Chapter 19. Consequences. I do remember that night with painful clarity. "Where are you off to now?" Kerne said to me as we waded through the ford and emerged into the market round. I remember how, as I paused to consider the old fire inn, he was bouncing on his heels in excitement, both nervous and eager to see Elayna. "Oh, I'll need to warn Bard Frey Murgathwin about what we saw," said I. "I can come with you," he immediately offered, conscious of his duty. No, said I. "You can tell them more tomorrow." But nay, tomorrow never came. Jorwin Weaver, The Keetish Cycle. A bitter mood descended on Leusios as he stood on the bank and watched the darkness where Kerne's limp form had drifted away. Rain coursed through his hair and down his neck unheeded as he felt his world change. What had he just done? Kerne made his choices, reasoned part of him. He shook his head. Only Elayna mattered. He wiped the dripping hair from his eyes and hurried back to the stilt hut full of dread. The hunters had followed his instructions. They had taken Greg and gone. Elayna still lay with her head on Kerne's trousers, covered by the hides he had thrown over her. Leusios did not have the power to heal. Nothing in his tomes or the mind of the Major would avail him. His was not the power to give life, only bend it and, if necessary, take it. Suddenly, he hated Kerne vehemently. The half-orc had taken the coward's way out. It was he, Leusios, who had to watch the woman they loved slip away. He felt her pulse. It was weakening, and her skin had lost its warmth. Impotent, he sobbed in frustration. Fate had decided to give him a lesson in humility. He lost all sense of time, so Jorwin and Vibnia surprised him when they charged up the steps and into the hut. "Can you help her, please?" He'd never heard himself beg anyone for anything before. He didn't care how his voice broke in desperation. He just wanted her to live. "We'll see," the bard murmured. "Build up the fire." They went about their business with solemn haste. Vibnia inspected Elayna, and then dripped a healing draught between her lips. Then she nodded, and Jorwin took his turn, examining the swelling on her skull and muttering his own words of power. Leusios watched helplessly. Will she live?" he asked. "Her skull is badly cracked. We can only know with time," Vibnia replied, her smooth professionalism heavy with regret. "She doesn't expect her to survive," Horth observed from where he hid up in the shadows of the roof beams. The raven was only echoing his own conclusion, adding to his crushing despair. He held her hand tighter. While the priest was calm, the bard was agitated. "Where's Kerne? Why isn't he here?" "I drove off Meekrig and his men," Leusios said. "But Kerne was already beyond me reach, in the river." "What? Why didn't you tell me?" Jorwin yelled angrily and ran out into the rain. Vibnia ignored the bard's abrupt departure and knelt back down beside him and Elayna. She brought her hands together in a precise clasp for prayer. "Will you join me?" "You pray?" Horth chuckled from his perch. Leusios grasped his hands to his heart as much in defiance of the raven as in desperation. If there was one thing he was willing to pray for, it was for the woman he loved. "It's so good to see you." Niall raised a hand in greeting from where he sat at the end of the long, rough-hewn wooden table to her left. He reached a hand towards her. Elayna stared at the offered palm. She was sitting in the middle of a long bench that matched the table's length. The table was rough and harsh under her fingers. In contrast, the bench was smooth like ice, letting her slide from side to side. "Niall?" She stared at her husband in dreamy astonishment. Her words echoed within her. Somewhere she felt a tremendous hurt, but it was muted, like a storm shut out behind a heavy oak door. The young man smiled and dug into a hot bowl of bean meal with a wooden spoon. It was a casual scene repeated so many times at home. She watched the steam rising invitingly, reminding her that she was cold and weak. The scent and promise of warm nourishment was tantalizing. He left the spoon in the meal and reached both hands towards her. "At least we can be at peace together." She turned her head away to the right and looked up to the opposite end of the table. There she saw Leusios and Kerne in an intense conversation. They were not far away, yet their voices were lost as if separated by a gulf of distance. She gazed at them, bewildered, not sure which one to cry out to. Kerne glanced away, but it was impossible to tell if he saw her. "Kerne?" It was the deep voice of her father that answered.
"Elayna!"
She turned back and saw his dingy outline behind the owl.
"I can't protect you if you stay out there."
"I don't need protecting."
"Elayna?"
Was that Leusios? She turned that way again. Leusios was looking in her direction, but not seeing her, his eyes straining and his words fading as they left his lips. "Elayna!" It was Niall again. He was stretching now from where he was rooted at the far end of the table, his open hands imploring her to slide down the bench to join him. "I'm so alone." "Niall, I felt something was going to happen that day. I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry." His voice was breaking. His hands grasped the table like a desperate man clinging to a tilting cliff face, his distended fingers unable to gain purchase. "Just hold me." Her heart aching, she slowly shook her head. No. You were killed." She inched away. The silhouette behind Niall raised an imploring arm. "Both of you." Tears rolled down her cheek like beads of ice. "You're dead." The shadows of the room closed in around her husband and father. "No, come with me." Even as Niall's voice rose in urgency, it died in volume. She looked back to the other two men. "Leusios?" The white mane of hair swept around as the young man looked in her direction again. There was a candle between them. It was the only light in the room and made shadows play across their faces. The half-orc's attention had drifted elsewhere, but the younger man was peering towards her as if trying to see through fog. She saw his lips move and, a heartbeat later, his voice reached her as a whisper. "Elayna." She looked back to Niall's end of the table. It was lost in shadow. She saw his bowl, now empty and dusty, as if neglected for years. She inched further away, feeling a flutter of panic. She instinctively realized the danger she was in. "Leusios! Kerne!" The candle in the center of the table flared. Suddenly, Vibnia was sitting opposite her, her precise voice cutting through the haze. "Elayna, come back to us. Be with us. Your body is strong. Your spirit is strong. Redet corpus humanus." The whole room warped into darkness and wrapped her in her stiff, immobile body. Her limbs refused to move. Even her tongue was leaden. The pain returned to her head like a hammer stroke.
"Elayna!"
The voice was distant, yet she recognized it. "Leusios!" A hand took her limp, unresponsive fingers and gave her a moment of strength. She squeezed with all her might, then she fell limp again.
I felt her hand twitch,"
Leusios gasped. Knowing she had made contact, she smiled. "I think her lips moved too," said Vibnia. She wasn't alone. Nestling into the comfort of that thought, she slept. Gray dawn light crept through the window. Leusios felt his heart skip a beat as Elayna's fingers twitched again, and then her eyes fluttered open. He bent close and whispered her name. "Leusios?" came the feeble response.
"Yes. Vibnia and Jorwin are here too."
Her brow wrinkled in pain.
"Headache?"
The moment he said it, Leusios realized it was a daft question. So I still have a head." It took him a moment to realize she was trying to smile. He grinned back.
"And your sense of humor's back too."
"What happened, Elayna?" Jorwin demanded softly. "What happened?" She winced as she reached for her memories through the hurt. She frowned and began to shake her head, only to stiffen with pain. "Nothing happened, but something must have." What did that mean? Leusios exchanged a glance with Jorwin and noticed that Vibnia's hands moved from her prayerful clasp to an analytical steepling of her fingers. "I remember I just checked the field," Elayna squinted, trying to remember. "And I came home. Then nothing."
"This is not nothing." Jorwin snatched up the shattered latch. "Kerne's gone, swept away by the river. I couldn't find him."
She stared at him blankly. "Kerne? What? When? How did that happen?"
Leusios bristled and interposed himself between them. "Jorwin, she's barely woken up."
"Surely you remember, Elayna." The bard swept his hand across the wreckage of the room in exasperation. "There was a fight." She flinched and looked at Leusios in confusion. I'm sorry. I remember nothing." Leusios put his arms around her and held her close.
"There was a fight. You took a nasty knock."
Jorwin muttered a string of oaths, pressing his thumb and forefinger into his brow as if he shared Elayna's pain.
"I must try again. I'll have better chance of finding him now there's light."
Those few words were strained with emotion. Another sentence might have broken him. The bard picked up his pack and spear, and then walked out without another word. After measured advice on further care, Vibnia politely took her leave and left the two of them alone. Leusios now played the role of carer to perfection, waiting on Elayna as if she was royalty. There was no need for haste, nor would there ever be now, because he had no credible rivals left to force the pace. Leusios had planned to stay all day with Elayna, but Ulthwin the potter took over his watch as she slept. "The council needs you," was all she would say. While he expected Murgathwin, Barfrain, and Gwindal, he was surprised to see Vibnia and Kulain. Murgathwin had insisted the session was private, and Leusios soon understood why.
"How many orcs?"
he asked in horror.
"Jorwin said that Kerne reckoned there was anything between 4,000 and 6,000,
Murgathwin said levelly. Kulain was the first to break the uneasy silence.
"You need to strengthen the alliances with Caesonius and Talianus, and fortify the pass at Traxian's Gate."
Vibnia nodded in agreement. "In the past, the people of Blackstone fled into the monastery, but ever since the gold, the population has become too big." Kulain is right. Duria has the engineering skill to build strong defenses. The gate is the narrowest point to hold the horde.
"But we don't have the money,"
argued Barfrain.
"Misfortune's been throttling this town."
Leusios was doing a swift calculation with his writing brush.
"We could expand the militia by several hundred if all the miners take out time to train. But it's going to make it even harder to make the gold mines pay. Add the Durian garrisons, we might stretch to 1,000 fighting men and women in all."
The door of the old fire inn swung open, and the bard entered with a chilly gust of wind. He turned his back on them and closed the door. He paused there, hands still pressed against the door, as if gathering himself.
"Ah, Jorwin, glad you came back,"
said Murgathwin. Her wrinkled hands clasped in worry.
"Did you find him?"
The bard did not answer. He strode up to their table, his face red and his eyes tired. Uncomfortable in the silence that followed, Leusios could not resist filling it.
"We've just learned about the orcs."
Jorwin finally spoke in a hoarse whisper, thick with emotion.
"And you've let them murder your best chance of beating them."
The silence that followed was tense. No one spoke.
"The very man who warned you was battered and drowned in the river,"
the bard continued. He drew in a shaky breath. Murgathwin pursed her wrinkled lips and thought carefully before answering.
"Blackstone must be united. Now, more than ever. I'll speak to Micrig and everyone involved. This will not go unpunished."
Leusios would always remember just how calmly Jorwin spoke his next dreadful words.
"Words cannot make amends. You killed the one guardian who could protect you from what's coming. Turn against a servant of Elayna, and she shall turn away from you."
Mistress Murgathwin stood up.
"Jorwin, in a small community, we have to make do with what we have. That's not just about eking out meager supplies, but the skills and knowledge of our people. Dear Jorwin, you are not the only one to love Kerne. No, there's no forgiveness for this. You should have muzzled Mikrig and welcomed a better man. This curse I put upon this place until Elayna sees fit to lift it. Nature shall spite this place and all who dwell here."
Leusios watched the bard's angry glare circle the table. He could not face it himself and looked down. Vibnia was impervious to it. She raised an eyebrow and drew breath to speak, but then decided better of it. The bard nodded brusquely, his jaw working with emotion, but his words were done. He turned and left. Akerbos slipped out of the mine, keeping to the shadows. He paused to listen, using a simple spiritual incantation to cast his senses deep underground. He nodded with satisfaction at the sound of screaming. The hallucinogenic oils he had rubbed onto the pick handles were taking effect. Thalianus would struggle to get any miners to dig further once the lurid tales of imagined phantoms spread. Next, he moved quietly up to the log wall of the hole. That was the name of the tavern that had sprung up amidst the mining works. Discreetly funded by the Presidia Salens, the hole provided strong liquor and distraction for the miners. It was also a gold mine in its own right for information. Akerbos moved between several gaps in the timbers to listen to snatches of conversation. He made a mental note as one overseer confided in another that they had ordered new tools from Lassivornum. That shipment would have to be delayed or misdirected. He scrambled up to one of the high paths above the mine road and made his way back to the site of the landslide he had caused several days ago. It would take days to clear. Good. He noted the construction of a simple tool shed nearby to aid the speed of the work. There were torches and braziers so the work would continue through the night. He waited patiently for the work teams to rotate. As the departing team stowed their tools, Akerbos slipped down to the shed, cloaked in shadow and his movements silenced by his arts. The next team of miners was waiting while two overseers from rival owners argued. No one saw him tip over the small barrel of pitch. It was solid in the cold of the night. No one heard him whisper his chant to suffuse it with enough heat to melt. No one saw its oozing flow creep beneath the brazier just outside the shed. Akerbos slipped back into the darkness and watched until an ember fell from the brazier and the pitch ignited. The orange-blue flame flowed unseen back into the shed. The barrel exploded in a splatter of viscous flame. A productive night's work, thought Akerbos. It was time to disappear again. Mikrig sat in the smoky darkness of his roundhouse. Once this had been a happy place, a memory so far back now that it was like the last glow of a dying day. Lilwyn, his mother, had been his son, full of maternal love and warmth. She had died giving birth to his sister, who also died, both lost in the famine that followed the failure of the first gold rush. Gathlin, his father, had been a hard man and had not buckled from grief. He took him and his older brother Hunthrig out to hunt regularly. He taught Mikrig that the hunters were crucial to Blackstone's survival. They brought meat, and they were the best warriors to defend against orcs. That earned them respect and authority. So the warmth may have gone from his home, but it remained a sanctuary until the orc attack. Gathlin's hunters were ambushed, and his father was killed. Hunthrig led Mikrig and all the other hunters out in retaliation, and walked right into the teeth of an orcish warband. After his flight to Blackstone and his subsequent battle, he had returned to an empty home, now only a place for hurt and grief to fester into anger. There was a knock on his door, and it opened. The moment he dreaded was at hand. Murgathwin's thin silhouette stood framed in the bright daylight. He backed off against the far wall. To the ignorant, she was a skinny old lady. To Mikrig, she was a harbinger of wrath and retribution. Even Orki could not muster the fury of the storm about to break upon him. That's the end of Chapter 19, Consequences. Next time, Elayna has survived and begins her long road of recovery. But will we discover the fate of our favorite half-orc? Find out. Your support has been amazing. Please keep showing some love by liking and sharing. See you next week.